What is going on, everybody, and welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush episode review. Today, guys, we are going to be going over episode 5 of Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush. I am very excited to be getting into this episode with you guys, so without further ado, let's jump right into it. So, generally speaking, what were my thoughts on episode 5 of Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush? I liked the episode. I think this is probably one of the better episodes of Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush, and I think one of the biggest reasons has to be the build-up and what this episode was all about, because we got to learn a lot in terms of plot for this show, especially when it came to the Earthamar and what I would call probably Yuhi's early rival with Kawaii Tell. And this episode, for me, I think exemplified how excited I have been to see Yuhi square off with Kawaii Tell ever since the last episode, where we learned that Kawaii Tell was indeed the one that stole the Earthamar from Yuhi. I have been so excited for this duel. Hell, this has been a duel that I've been excited for before even the show began. Ever since we had gotten the bio for Kawaii Tell and it mentioned that he had some connection with Yuhi, my immediate thought was, yep, we have to see these two square off at some point in the show. You know, this could be Yuhi's alien that he faces off throughout the show, because obviously you're going to have Yugioh and Zwaijo. We kind of had Yuumu and Chupataro, even though I feel like that could potentially change at some point. But Yuhi and Kawaii Tell was a matchup that had to happen. The fact that Kawaii Tell directly in his bio mentioned Yuhi, and from the last episode we learned that he stole the Earthamar, this was a matchup that just had to happen. And the fact that it's happening the episode after Kawaii Tell was actually introduced into the show was fascinating to say the least, but I'm not complaining about it, especially since this has been a matchup that I've wanted to see for a while, because not only did we get to see that matchup, but we got to learn about more of the Earthamar. But before we can even really get into any of that, we got to start at the beginning of the episode, where after an unfortunate incident with Yugioh in the washer and dryer at the UTS building, they were essentially forced to have to go and take their clothes to the laundromat so that way they can actually have some clothes that they can wear throughout the day, even though they just wear the same clothes. And when Yuhi goes to the laundromat to go and pick up the clothes, and then you have Yugioh and Yuumu going and getting the new washer and dryer, Yuhi goes into the building, he gets his clothes, and he realizes that the clothes are still soaking wet. And obviously that's not what you want to expect when you're coming out of a laundromat. You expect your clothes to be, well, clean and dry. And the fact that Yuhi was getting wet clothes made him pretty upset, which, let's be honest, most people would be upset if you went to a laundromat and you found out that your clothes were still wet, especially since Yuhi kind of freaked out a little bit because he knew that one of the clothes that were in the pile was one of Yumu's favorite dresses, and he knows how mad she would be if she found out that her favorite dress is still soaking wet because they didn't do their job properly. So obviously, you know, Yuhi extremely upset with this, you know, yells at the person on the front desk, which funny enough is the girl from the ending, which is pretty fascinating to say the least. And you know, he's yelling at her about the whole situation and asks to go and speak to the manager. So he goes into the building to go and speak to the manager, and we find out that the manager is Kawaii Tell himself. You know, we see him ironing out the clothes. You know, he's still getting them soaking wet because apparently he's just soaking wet, and also is drinking, you know, pickle water, which apparently is a Kappa thing, because for people that don't know, this is what he is based off of. He's based off of the Kappa cryptid. So that is very fascinating to say the least. So we're kind of seeing more of these alien cryptids getting more developed into the show, because that just seems what's going to be a consistent aspect of this show, is that different aliens are going to be different cryptids. You know, you had the Chupacabra from the third episode where we had Chupataro introduced, and now you have the Kappa monster in the form of Kawaii Tell. And immediately Yuhi recognizes this guy as he was the one that stole his Earthamar, and that's been his whole goal since the very beginning of the show. So he immediately knows who this guy is, and even Kawaii Tell notices that it's Yuhi, and Yuhi is yelling at him to give him his Earthamar back before Kawaii Tell is able to activate a trap switch and basically set him down to the laboratory. And Kawaii Tell meets him down there. He goes and shows him his true form, and basically Yuhi challenges him to a duel to get his Earthamar back. And Kawaii Tell agrees to the duel, but on one condition, to where if he wins, then he gets the Earthamar back. That's pretty nice. He's been searching for this from the beginning. Obviously, that's a fair deal. However, the twist with it is that if Yuhi loses this duel, he's forced to be trapped in his laboratory so that way he can do experiments to kind of quench his thirst for research, because this whole Earthamar situation has kind of messed him up because he cannot crack the code of the Earthamar. So obviously he gets frustrated by this, and that's why we see him like soaked in water, is because he's trying to soak in all of the knowledge that he has, but because this Earthamar has confused him so much on what the hell this substance even is, obviously he wants to try to find a way to quench his thirst, and he believes the way of doing that is by doing experiments on Yuhi that might potentially help him understand more about the Earthamar, because obviously this Earthamar was Yuhi's and is very important to Yuhi, so there has to be some bond with the Earthamar, which we learn a little later on, but like I said, we'll get into that in a little bit. But because of that connection, it makes sense why Kawaii Tell is wanting to kind of do experiments on Yuhi. So right off the bat, we have a pretty intense duel for this show, especially early on, and that's something I'm really gonna like with this show, because obviously we kind of have more of the darker tone already with like the war and all that stuff, and to kind of see these more high stake duels, I'm really happy with that, because I felt like Sevens was kind of lacking on it. Now, to be fair, obviously we came from Reigns, which was very serious, to the point where 90% of the duels were life inducing, or the AI were on the line. So obviously, we had that whole thing that was going on, but Sevens didn't really have too many high stakes. It did have some, but I don't know, like they were far in between. And I feel like with this show, because we have the whole more darker tone to this show, I feel like you can have more stipulations like this where it's a little bit more darker and a little bit more serious, and I absolutely love that. So we set up for the duel between Yuhi and Kawaii Tell, and immediately we have a problem, as Yuki cannot activate his duel disc because it got wet when he was going to the laundromat. He actually had left his duel disc with it as well, and his duel disc was still soaking wet, so he couldn't use his duel disc until the Velvigas, I might be pronouncing that wrong, the spaceship with the 8.88 million people in it, are there as well, and they actually are able to transform into a duel disc, so that way Yuhi can actually duel in this episode. And also around this point, this is when Yuhi and Yuumu actually, or Udius and Yuumu, excuse me, were able to find Yuhi and what in the world he was even doing. And what's very interesting about Kawaii Tell is that he already knows about Velgear, because when Udius and Yumu come to Yuhi and kind of trying to figure out what the hell is even going on, Kawaii Tell mentions the Velgears, and Udius is kind of surprised by this, so you already kind of have some connections there, or at least in a sense where Kawaii Tell knows about the Velgears, and we learn why that's the case a little later on, which I'm very excited to talk about, but again, we gotta wait a little bit on that. But obviously they're there to kind of support Yuhi, because obviously this is a big moment for him, because obviously this is his big chance to get their Earthamar back, and thanks to the people in the spaceship being able to actually help Yuhi be able to have a duel disc to duel, obviously we can commence the duel between Yuhi and Kawaii Tell. And in my opinion, I'm going to be completely honest, I was pretty disappointed in this duel. Not saying there wasn't great moments. I think there was one standout moment of the episode, and that was when the 8.88 million people basically helped Yuhi by not only transforming into the duel disc, but after a trap card was not activating during the duel because they didn't have something plugged in the duel disc, because this was something that they never done before, we see Yuhi chanting to the people and basically giving them encouragement, and obviously all the people in the duel disc, are rallying with Yuhi. They basically accepted them as one of their own, and basically they all work together to basically plug in a switch so that way his trap card could be used, so that way he can stop from losing the duel. So that was a very good moment. But besides that, and even getting to see Yuhi's ace for the first time, which was really cool as well, I did have some problems with the duel. The biggest one being the tutorial aspect of this episode. Obviously, we're still in the tutorial duels right now. In fact, this episode was more focused on defense position and kind of like how that whole system works. So I understand, like, yeah, that's important to learn about that, and I do think it is worth an episode to do that, but in my opinion, kind of just looking at these last 5 episodes, I felt like you could have condensed it into 3, maybe 4 to kind of flesh it out a little bit more, but I don't think it needed to take 5 episodes to do a tutorial duel. I felt like you could have maybe had this whole defense mechanic in the first episode, because I'm going to be honest, the first duel of the show with the Udius versus Yuhi was pretty boring in my opinion. I was just not a big fan of it, and just because of how basic it was. Adding the whole defense aspect to it, I think would have been very fascinating for that first duel, and I think would have really helped that duel improve, because like I said, it was pretty boring. And another issue with the whole tutorial aspect is that they explain traps again in this episode, which bothers me because we spent the entirety of the last episode explaining trap cards. Now, obviously, they weren't dueling, so you couldn't really get an aspect of, in terms of dueling, how the traps worked, but I felt like they did a really good job of explaining traps without actually having to show how a duel works. You have to set the trap before you can actually activate it, and you have to fit the requirements just like you have to do it with spell cards and activating monster effects. So I felt like it wasn't really that hard to learn it, and I think they did it in a very unique way. But the fact that they had to explain it again in this episode is like, what was the point in episode 4 if in the very next episode you're gonna explain it again? Like, there was no goddamn reason that we needed to have another explanation of how traps worked. And honestly, in my opinion, I felt like you could have done spells and traps together. I don't really think they needed to be separate. I don't mind if they're separate, but again, I'm trying to condense it as much as I possibly can. So if you did the first episode, just basics, you don't go into advanced summoning or affect monsters and all that stuff, and you just learn about attack and defense position and do that in one episode, I think that's great. The second episode, you can focus on tribute summoning. You can even throw in special summoning if you want to as well, because it's not really that relevant in rush duels, because that's probably going to be explained at some point, maybe in the next episode, which I hope to God not. I would love if they just kind of went away with the tutorial duels for a little bit and maybe go back to that once we get closer to like maximums and fusion monsters. I think that would be great, but we're going to have to wait and see on that. So maybe you could have just done tribute summoning and how effect monsters work in the second episode, and in the third episode you can explain spells and traps, and hell, if you want to separate them, have episode 4, do exactly what you did in episode 4 of explaining the traps, and that's it. Don't do anything else out of it. We did not need 5 episodes to do all the tutorial duels. I felt like you could have condensed it to 3 or 4 episodes. Ideally 3, I could live with 4, but I think 5 is pushing it a little too much. So that's my first issue with it. And the other issue that I had with the duel was a particular moment when Kawaii Tell summons his ace monster. My god, did it look not right at all. I don't want to say it looked terrible. It just didn't fit very well, because they did a weird animation with the monster. In fact, we kind of see a comparison of the two monsters on the field, and they don't look the same at all. This monster looks like it shouldn't be in this art style. And the fact that they used it in this episode was just so weird that it just didn't make it look good. Like, don't get me wrong, the ace monster looks very interesting to say the least, but be consistent with your animation. I don't know how the hell you ended up getting this with Kawaii Tell's ace monster, but it just did not look right because they're just not the same animation, you know, they're not this, or not animation, but you know what I mean, they're not the same animated monsters. Like, how the hell did you go from the typical, you know, Studio Bridge style to whatever the hell you had in this episode? Like, it made no sense for these two monsters to look completely different when it comes to how they were animated. Like, it just made no sense. So that, in my opinion, I do think it kind of took away from Kawaii Tell's big turn when he summoned his ace monster, because I just couldn't get over it. It just looked so freaking terrible, and I don't know how the hell they messed that up. And a worry that I have with it is that, is this how the ace monster is going to look every single time that we see Kawaii Tell duel? Honestly, that doesn't really make me excited for Kawaii Tell's duels going forward, because we know every time he summons his ace monster, it's gonna look like this, and it just looks terrible. I'm sorry, it does not look good, because it's not that the monster looks bad, it's just that you can't have these two distinct animations in the same show and think it fits. It looks horrible, it looks horrific, it just does not fit. This is a issue that needs to immediately change, because there is no reason that these two monsters should look as different as they do. I think they need to be in the same animation art style. Like, they have to, because they just do not look right together. But besides that, that's really the only complaints. Everything else I just thought was fine. Again, the tutorial duels just kind of really took a backside with this duel, especially since how hyped I was for it, and the fact that they kind of had to tamper it, not only with that weird, you know, art style for the Kawaii Tell ace monster, but the fact that it had to be a part of the tutorial aspects from, you know, what kind of has honestly kind of downgraded the show a little bit right now. Now, obviously, this is going to change, and I still think Go Rush has been doing very strongly. It's just, I'm just gotten sick and tired of the tutorial duels, and I know, you know, they want to do it for newer viewers, but it just did not need to take this long, in my opinion. So, you know, besides that, I thought everything else was okay. I just was a little disappointed by that, especially for how hyped I was in regards to this duel. But Yuhi gets his massive win, which I will say is a very big benefit about this duel. You know, not only was he able to get revenge from losing to Kawaii Tell before the show even began, but this was his first win of the show on screen, so that was really great to see, and I cannot wait to see, you know, Yuhi grow as a character. And I think he was definitely the MVP of this episode. He definitely grew a lot, in my opinion, because I definitely think he's been one of the weaker characters of the show so far, but definitely his stock has definitely risen for me from this episode. But the end of this episode is where I am really excited to talk about. So obviously, by the stipulations, since Kawaii Tell lost, he gave him back to Earthamar, and Yuhi just didn't seem right when he got the Earthamar, and he started freaking out about the Earthamar. And when he opens it, we see this weird liquid gas, whatever the hell thing, come out of the container that was holding the Earthamar at it, and it was the shadow figure that looked like Yuhi. Like, what the hell is this? And it seems like this is a part of Yuhi's body. Like, this episode, although I was very excited to learn more about the Earthamar, it left me with more questions than anything, because after that, we see the big reveal of Zwaijo out of nowhere, because I don't know if he came out of the jar, or I don't know where the hell he came from, but he snatched the Earthamar out of nowhere, so he's interested in this Earthamar as well. He grabs the Earthamar, and Udius is surprised by this, because obviously he believed that Zwaijo had died or something had happened to him, and the fact that he's not only alive, but here on Earth, just put him in complete shock. And what I loved about it too is that we got no voice lines from him, which is very interesting to see, at least, but I honestly don't mind it. It makes it more ominous. And, you know, he just looks back at the group, and then he just goes away. You know, he tries to get away from the scene, and, Yudius is trying to call out to him, he doesn't listen, and then Kawaii Tell disappears out of nowhere, which is very interesting, and Manabu appears out of nowhere at the end of this episode as well, because earlier on in the episode, he was trying to get some information from Chubutaro, even singing to the point where he actually made him cry, which was very interesting to say the least. And we get to learn, about, or at least the characters get to learn that this person, Zwaijo, has something to do with Yudius, and, they're all shocked by this, and then Yudius doesn't answer them. He looks at the buildings where Zwaijo jumped to, and basically that's how the episode ends, as now these characters know that Zwaijo has some importance with the Velgear Star Cluster, and obviously Yudius knows about him because he literally mentioned him in this episode. So it's very fascinating, to say the least, when it came to the Earthamar. Now that Yudius knows that Zwaijo is alive, it's going to be very interesting to see him kind of process the whole situation and the events that just occurred, because like I said earlier, he thought that he had died during that whole explosion scene that we saw in episode 2. So I can't wait to see and kind of learn a little bit of kind of how, Yudius is feeling right now. Obviously a lot just happened in this episode with the whole Earthamar and finding out that Zwaijo is alive. Like, obviously there's a lot that's going on right now. And the fact that we're going out of this episode with the Earthamar with more questions than answers, I absolutely love about it. I am super involved with this Earthamar, and I cannot wait to learn more about Zwaijo and why he faked his death, which is what I believe happened. I do believe he faked his death, and I cannot wait to learn more about the Earthamar and why Zwaijo wants the Earthamar in the first place, because obviously he thinks it's so important that he takes it away from Yuhi after he won it back fair and square, which I expected that to happen because there was no way he was going to just keep the Earthamar and that would be it. It would make no sense from a story perspective, but I'm very fascinated to learn about these aspects and why Zwaijo wants to know about the Earthamar, or, why he's so insists on having the Earthamar. But with that being said, that's going to be it for this episode review. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know your guys' thoughts on episode 5. Did you like the episode? Did you think the episode is okay? Or did you not really like the episode at all? Let me know your guys' thoughts on the formal debut of Kawaii Tell, or what I think is the formal introduction, because although we did see him in the last episode, the fact that this was his big role in the show so far, I feel like that's why I wanted to kind of ask this question in this video, even though he was introduced in episode 4. But I want to know your guys' thoughts early on Kawaii Tell, and your guys' thoughts on Zwaijo's reveal in this episode. And I would love to know your guys' thoughts on the duel between Yuhi and Kawaii Tell. Would love to hear all your guys' thoughts on these topics down below, as well as just the episode, like I said, in general. But with that being said, that's going to be it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, guys, take care and have yourselves a great rest of your day. まるで蜃気楼手を伸ばして蜃気楼真っ白に染ま